Is it important to get a diagnosis?
That's a good question. So one way that it can be helpful to have a diagnosis is a lot of times people wonder what's next. So maybe they're coming to treatment and they're like, I want to know more about myself. I want to understand what's going on. And once they've had, that conceptualization of, what's actually going on, maybe it's, anxiety or depression. And once they get a clear picture of that diagnosis, it's a good way for the clinician to kind of say like, okay, here's a good treatment plan of where we can go next.
And do you need to be referred elsewhere for medication management or some other form of treatment? It can be really helpful. I also think that sometimes it can just get in the way. Some people can get really caught up in having a specific diagnosis or thinking that a specific diagnosis is bad, or that somehow it will cause them problems. And so when that happens, I try to get people to think about, what's interfering in your life, and that's the part that's really important. So if having a diagnosis of bipolar disorder is helpful to you, then let's talk about what that means. Perhaps you need to be referred for medication. This is a particular treatment plan that you can have. Having that diagnosis can help for kids in schools. They need to have that for special accommodations. Have parents understand their behavior through a lens of, okay, this is what's happening versus my kid is just being difficult. But it can also cause people a lot of anxiety to have a particular diagnosis, and this doesn't feel like who I am, or I don't want people to judge me for having a particular diagnosis. And then I really talk with people about, so what does it really mean, right? Like if you can look at a particular symptom constellation, right? Like you have these symptoms, then what are you going to do about it? I think that's what I always go back to in therapy is, what are you going to do about it? You can take medicine. Are you going to follow this, kind of sleep plan? Are you going to interact with people in a different way? That's why having a diagnosis can be helpful to understand what is happening. And then it's really, what do you do with it? And can you find a way to make that diagnosis useful? Or do you just decide, that's not that helpful, I'm going to focus on this other thing instead?
Yeah, I like to remind people too that, just a diagnosis or a label does not mean it presents the same for everyone. Let's just take like depression, for example, that can look very different. So just reminding them of, it presents different ways. Like with this diagnosis, like you said, what are you going to do with that? What's the next step?